Ron Jude, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my records and my books and how my listening and looking interests often align. I have a tendency to look at books and listen to records at the same time. They don't always necessarily have anything to do with each other as I'm listening and looking, but it's often the case that I'll pull something off the shelf that is of a similar sensibility in terms of a photo book to what I might be listening to as a record. For the past few years, I've been listening to a lot of vinyl. That's one aspect of my listening habits. I think vinyl is interesting as a way to listen to music in general because of what it sort of demands from you as a listener. I think it's not just a sort of fetishizing of things that are analog. I actually think it requires you to sort of sit down and focus on what you're listening to. It's when I put a record on, it's rarely something that's sort of playing in the background. It's usually something that I'm sitting there very sort of consciously listening to, either through speakers or on my headphones. Besides the sort of format that I listen to, I've also been really sort of getting into, thanks to a couple of friends of mine, things that are sort of operating on the fringe of what you might consider to be popular music or even music in general. Really it's sort of about sound in general. And those things that are sort of operating at the fringe of what we might consider to be mainstream often sort of align with some of the things I'm interested in terms of photography books. More often than not, especially lately, I find myself pulling books off of my shelf that are typically produced by artists who happen to be working with the photographic medium, rather than photographers per se, sort of producing like sort of storytelling oriented photo books, which I certainly love that form, and I've experimented a lot with that myself. But I'm really drawn to people who are sort of operating outside of the medium in terms of how they define themselves as artists, and doing really interesting things with the medium. And I think that's sort of echoes some of my interest in some of the music I listen to and some of the sort of sound artists I listen to. So, at a glance, some of the books I've been looking at lately and have looked at for years and continue to look at. This is You Are the Weather by Ronnie Horn. It's a great example of somebody who sort of understands the photographic medium from outside of the medium itself, and sort of does really sort of interesting both books and installations with the medium. I've seen a number of shows of hers in New York over the years that are just really terrific shows. I've always been a huge fan of Gabriel Orozco. This is a Smithsonian publication that was put out quite a while ago, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. It's simply called Photographs. Orozco is a multimedia artist for sure, but typically when I think of him as a sculptor, and photography plays into his practice in a way that really sort of bridges what I consider to be a pretty narrow gap between sculpture and photography. Something photo-based people might be a little more in tune with, especially lately, is this really amazing book by Tayo Honorato and Nico Krebs, The Great Unreal. This is probably going on 10 years old, something like that. This is an amazing book that just does sort of wildly experimental things with the medium. And amazingly, if you know this book and you know the work, I always marvel at the fact that none of this is done in post-production. It's all done sort of in camera. And if you look at the images, it's sort of it's hard to imagine how many of the images were actually executed. Um, okay, sort of relating back to Gabriel Orozco, this book by Officially Advice has always been one of my favorites. Another photographic book by sculptors. um, this is a really nice, hefty catalog from Museum of Contemporary Art in LA show that I saw 25 years ago or so, Sigmar Polka's photo works. This is just amazing. This was a show that I saw that sort of convinced me of something that I didn't think was possible, which was the sort of mannered approach to the medium that could produce surprising and really sort of amazingly thoughtful pieces that, you know, to this day I've never gotten past it. I still go back to this catalog and a couple of other polka books that I have that are just phenomenal. And again, like the book I just showed you, this is a book by Martin Boyce, but it's produced by Mack, much more in line with a sort of strictly photographic sensibility. But again, here you have an artist known for working in other media, doing photographic work that is sort of aligned with that sensibility, but sort of equally engaging work in photography. This is one of my sort of all-time favorite photography books that was put out. Again, I think it was probably around 10 years ago or so. This is called A Partial Eclipse by Martin Boyce. This one's only a couple years old, but the work dates back to the 70s. This is John Davola's Vandalism, another Mack book. John Davola's, for my money, is one of the more interesting artists working with the medium of photography. He consistently works with the medium, but his sensibility is definitely that of an artist who is working with the medium in ways that sort of explores how the medium itself works. So he's invested in things, I think, in a way that is much more sort of experimental and open to new possibilities for the medium than a lot of what we're used to seeing, especially in photography books. I love this book and I love all of his work. So this is a book that a lot of people might be familiar with. It certainly sort of moves into the territory of what we might consider to be more traditional photography. This is Geert Goris's Lying Awake from a few years ago, and this is I really love Geert's work in the sense that on the surface it can appear to be a sort of straight ahead kind of documentary approach to the medium, but it's a pretty highly conceptual way that he's working and putting images together that I think really does become pretty experimental in tone once you actually see the work in exhibition or in book form. So this is another one, and I love it when photographers sort of like Geert and like John Davola allow themselves to sort of see the sort of broader potential for the medium within the context of contemporary art. So those are some artists working with the medium of photography that I think are really sort of interesting and experimental and kind of keep me engaged and interested in surprising ways. And when I pull records off the shelf, when I'm looking at these books, on one end of the spectrum, you know, I've been listening to things like this, like B.J. Nilsson's Massive Trophies. B.J. Nilsson is I would call him a sound artist. So it's not, you know, music in the traditional sense. You're not going to tap your toe along to this. What you're listening to here, if you've never listened to B.J. Nilsson's work, is field recordings primarily, sort of mixed together into compositions. And my friend and collaborator Joshua Bonetta sort of put me on to B.J. Nelson and a number of other people doing really interesting work in this way. Felicia Atkinson is an amazing artist. This record is called A Ready-Made Ceremony. This is one of my favorites and one of my go-tos that I listen to pretty frequently. This is Felicia's, I think, her most recent. It's pretty new. This one's called The Flower and the Vessel. And she and her partner Bart run a really terrific press called Shelter Press in France. And they're really interesting in the sense that they put out a lot of music as well as photography books. So it's a really nice sort of cross-pollination between those two mediums. Joshua Bonetta, who I mentioned already, he is a friend of mine and a collaborator and an experimental filmmaker as well as a sound artist, and he's got a number of LPs. This one is called Strange Lines and Distances, and this is an LP that runs parallel to a film by the same name. If you don't know his work, I highly recommend sort of checking him out. Go to his website, check out his films. And he's incredibly ambitious and working all the time and doing really sort of amazing work. And we collaborated on something a few years ago, the book that I did with Mack called Lago. He produced 2 sound compositions for that were put out by Shelter Press. Okay, so my way into that kind of much more sort of experimental stuff that you're not likely to find at your local record store has been through a sort of long-standing interest in prog rock and post-rock, even sort of slightly cornier stuff like Genesis, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And I say it corny almost because it's sort of a guilty pleasure that I like this stuff. I still really love this and I listen to it all the time. Sort of, Peter Gabriel era Genesis, along with, King Crimson and Pink Floyd and that stuff. This is a little more recent, but still, quite old at this point. I think this came out in like 1989 or something like that. This is Talk Talk's The Spirit of Eden. I think this would qualify as what we would call post-rock. So there's prog rock and there's post-rock, and I think basically what all of that means is basically people taking the form of pop rock music and experimenting with it, making concept albums and doing long-form compositions, stuff that's not going to make it onto the radio, that kind of thing. A little more recent, Mogwai's Come On Die Young. This one's really terrific too. Mogwai is a little hit and miss for me, but this one's definitely a hit. I highly recommend this one. And last but not least, Godspeed You Black Emperor. I've got pretty much the whole catalog on vinyl, and this is stuff that I listen to not all the time, but pretty frequently, and especially when I'm in the studio and I'm sort of trying to find a certain space within which to work and sort of think about my work. Godspeed is pretty go-to, along with a few other bands. And all of this stuff, I think, sort of feeds into this idea of a kind of an experimental thought process and experimental approach to both music making and photography that I find very valuable. And I tend to sort of toggle back and forth in my thinking with my own work in terms of how experimental I want to get, but hopefully it's all, at least on some level, experimental enough to keep it interesting. All right, that's it for me in Eugene, Oregon. It's a beautiful sunny day. We're all trapped in the house, but at least we can get out and keep our distance from everybody and enjoy the sunshine. All right, thanks.